welcome you all to our web conference today on gender transformative strategies to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence, exploring outcomes from Manhood 2.0 implementation. My name is Ashley Klein-Jimenez, and I am with Prevent Connect and Valor US. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or Valor. I almost said CalCasa. So we have a couple of objectives for you all today. We're going to be talking about the prevention implications of the recent Manhood 2.0 study, and we'll be sure to see what you all are, how familiar you all are with that in a little bit. We're also going to be thinking about ways for prevention practitioners and implementers to support youth, to create space for dialogue and connecting around violence, connecting violence to racial and gender equity. And then we'll be thinking about how can we embed gender transformative content into other youth supportive programming, such as job training, to really think about how expansive we can get with sexual and intimate partner violence. So with that, David, I would love to bring you into this conversation because I know that you've been thinking about gender transformative strategies for a long time. So I'm handing it to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you. It's great seeing we're over 300 people, and I'm seeing many old friends and colleagues, and many people, and getting a chance to meet new people. And so it's wonderful to be doing this. This has been a topic throughout the 16 years of Prevent Connect that we've been addressing, and for me, it's been going back from when I started this work in the 1980s. And so I put a few of my path, what I call my path to prevention as a man, in ways to be working and engaging men. And so on the left, you see a flyer for a demonstration that I went to in 1985 called Brother Storm. And it was a group of men that were going to be marching to be able to oppose sexual violence and male violence. And it was really an exciting event to be gathering. It was in St. Louis, Missouri, and people from all around the country had gathered and be able to share. And it was important for we as men to be talking to other men about the importance of looking at men's violence and what we can be able to do differently. And this pro-feminist men's movement was an important piece of my development and understanding and being able to find ways that we would be able to do this, because we knew that there were so many the ways that dominant form of masculinities were enacted would created the conditions where we saw male violent behavior. And as I continued in this work and moved to California, I was living in Connecticut. I started this work in Connecticut, but moved to California in 1984. And I was able to connect with a wide variety of people. And so I put a curriculum called Young Men's Work that was put together by the Oakland Men's Project with Alan Creighton and Paul Kivel were the authors of this. And that was influential, and those were mentors for me in learning about how to be able to work with young men and think about how we would be able to transform. And this was some of the early work that came, this was published in the 90s, and it was some of the work that I had done in the 80s and the 90s of being able to move forward. And as I've advanced, I've gone through and thought more about how we as men can be able to do this work, and to think then about what prevention programming. And so as I got involved in public health in the early 1990s, was able to think about that work, and later on went back to school, got my MPH, and we can see that some of these gender transformative strategies exist within our public health understanding about how to prevent gender-based violence. So next slide, please, Tori. So here I have put together in the technical packages from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And there's the Stop SV technical package to prevent sexual violence, and the Preventing Intimate Partner Violence Across the Lifespan. And they highlight strategies and approaches to be able to prevent sexual violence or intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And in those, you'll see included is ways that we're involving working with men and boys, whether it was in promoting social norms or being able to to be able to have an impact with influencers and peers to be able to help create that change, and that this becomes ways that our public health understanding is building upon the work that had been going on. And so that is a way that becomes important and as we think about what strategies we can be able to gauge. I often think of my life has been the career of combining the activism along with the public health science that we can move forward. Next slide. And so over the next, in the last 20 years, we've seen a wide variety of gender transformative strategies. Now, I just listed a few that are working with men and boys, and these are just some of these examples. Some of them have different focuses. So there's the coaching boys into men, which actually the research was done by one of our guests, Liz Miller, who is stuck in a legislative hearing right now, so I was hoping to join us. The work of Men Can Stop Rape with their MOST clubs and other activities, a call to men with their different strategies of being able to working with coaches and working with young men and boys, MVP strategies with their mentors in violence prevention, with looking at bystander and engaging men. We'll be hearing about Project H and Manhood 2.0 from Pomundo later on. In Canada, there's White Ribbon, which is the work going on there. And I just highlighted two prevention efforts of working with men, working with other men that are happening through our Delta programs with the O-Man in Ohio, or the 10 Men, which is happening in Rhode Island. I see tomorrow that in Rhode Island, they're going to be having an event, a public event, to be able to share some of the work they're doing. So there's become a wide variety of strategies. Now, we're going to be talking about Manhood 2.0, but we're really thinking broadly about how to use the lessons of Manhood 2.0 for either implementing that or being able to implement other gender transformative strategies, which are so important for the work that we're trying to be able to do. So Ashley, I'd like to go to the audience now and learn, because we have such a brilliant audience. So let's ask a question of the audience. We'd love to hear from you. How are you incorporating gender norms in your violence prevention work? If there's gender transformative work, and now we're talking about with men, of course, there's also transformative work with women and girls, which are also in the technical packages that are here. But today we'll be focusing on the work with those who are male identified, but would love to be able to think about how people are doing that in their communities. So Ashley, I see 7 schools doing coaching boys men with 7 schools, working with a call to men to change school norms on campus and engage men, using the man box and woman box activities. Alaska Men Choose Respect. They switched from media literacy to a call to men's live respect. And so a student post Instagram, more coaching boys into men. Ashley, these are coming. Designed a program called
There's
Girls Academy for high school girls. New legislation in Washington mandating comprehensive sex ed, which includes gender inclusive learning objectives. We'll be implementing these new standards in the schools this year. More coaching boys and men. Project Roots. Kelly, if you can say a little bit more about that. Steph works with multiple fraternities on the college campus, as well as their philanthropy. Prevails 100 Men campus. Great to be able to see it. Doing a lesson on social norms. Great. I see people are already doing what we do in Prevent Connect. They're starting to have conversations with each other. It's great to see Liz Miller, who has been able to join us. And so we do this. Delaware Men, another program that was done through the Delta Impact Program. So it's been talking about the difficulty in sustaining that work. And I think we want to talk about, looking, and Michael raised a really good issue about how we're going to do things male, female, and also transgender and non-conforming people, to be able to think about how we can do this. Southeast Alaska. So Ashley, I'm seeing a wide variety of people that are doing trainings, working on policy, doing curriculum, coming up with programs. I've seen a lot of adaptations about how to be able to work with different, like Sarah talks about an indigenized adaptation of a call to men, live respect. So trying to be able to make sure that these are going to be culturally appropriate, meet the needs. I think Manhood 2.0 one of the things I love about it is adapting a program that was implemented in Brazil and then looking at how we can implement it in the United States. I think there's so many lessons we can learn from different places. So actually, we see a wide range.
Yes, I saw a lot of those things too, David. Lots of work happening. So we can move on, Tori. We'll come back to our audience in just a few minutes, but we do want to introduce our guests, and I think Liz has been able to join us, so that's great. So we're really excited. We have a wonderful panel of guests today that you all will be hearing from, including Elizabeth Miller, Allison, I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name because now I'm just not sure.
It's Solba, yes. Thanks.
Oh, I would have gotten that very
Not at all like it
Thank you,
looks.
Allison.
Everything's silent. Yes, exactly.
Thanks, Allison. We have Jose Garth here to talk about implementing Manhood 2.0 and Gary Barker from Pro Mundo. So we are so excited to hear from all of our guests. And I think at this point, David, we are turning this over to Liz. We're turning it over to you, if I am not mistaken.
Yes, yes, yes. Can you hear me okay, Ashley and David? Awesome.
We sure can.
Yay. What an amazing privilege to be here with you. I'm sorry to our organizers, my goodness, for causing alarm. I was part of an incredible opportunity with Senator Casey and Billy Porter today, talking about the vital importance of the Equality Act. And really, it is amazing to have this opportunity now to talk about why doing gender justice work is fundamentally tied to transformative justice. And we're going to talk about that more. I'm immensely grateful to the many partners who are part of this work with us in Pittsburgh, including our colleagues at PAR and Center for Victims and the FISA Foundation. I was like rapidly looking to see who all the participants are, but I'm just so grateful also to see my dear friend Julie Evans on this call, who was vitally part of the creation of the Manhood 2.0 curriculum. So spectacular. Next slide. So I want to start but with a pause, right? Because in a short webinar like this, we cannot cover the gamut of healing justice and transformative justice frameworks, and really want to hold each of us, myself included, accountable for thinking about this work in the context of anti-racist and trauma-sensitive practice. What Sean Ginwright and others have termed healing-centered engagement. And as we talk about the curriculum, but more importantly with our audience, learning about ways in which you have embedded and understood the ways in which continuous oppression and systemic racism impacts the lives of the young people we serve, and where and how we can actually improve our prevention programming. Next slide. So in that context is a recognition of many types of childhood adversities. And for us to make sure that we are constantly bringing back into our conversations, including conversations with young people about histories of oppression, recognizing that community violence, bullying, poverty are also part of childhood adversities and the ways in which that affects health and well-being. So as I talk about the origins of Manhood 2.0, want to recognize that this work is situated in a broader effort to address these systemic inequities. Next slide. So this work also is on the shoulder of incredible giants, heroes for so many of us. Certainly Tarana Burke and Dr. Blasey Ford, Chanel Miller, and so many others who in the past decade have raised their voices and really continuously reminded us about the ways in which addressing sexual violence is also about dismantling white patriarchy. Next slide. The work, though, is one that is incredibly important for all of us, but certainly for us in Pittsburgh, where we lost and continue to have lost so many people to police brutality, including a young person, Antoine Rose Jr., and want to recognize the memories of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many others in this work, and creating space and opportunity to be in conversation about continuous learning for ourselves, including learning from our young people's lived experiences. And you will hear more about that today as well. So next slide. So the work that our research team has had the privilege of doing here in Pittsburgh in partnership with many community partners goes back a number of years, where we had some exploratory funding from the National Institutes of Health to begin using arts-based strategies and what is a method called visual voices, as well as concept mapping, as a way to open a conversation with young people and explore masculinity scripts in early adolescence. And while I don't have time to go into that in detail today, just want to point you to a reference here led by Dr. Michael Jonas here in Pittsburgh around visual voices as a participatory approach. And we actually embedded a shortened version of visual voices into the Manhood 2.0 curriculum, as we found it really opened up space for conversation. Next slide. So I am going to turn this over, though, to truly one of the heroes in this space of gender transformative work, whom I've learned a tremendous amount from, Dr. Gary Barker. And as we and talk about sort of the origins of where and how and the underpinnings around social justice that comes into this work, and where and how it was that we took the lessons learned from Brazil and brought it to Pittsburgh. So Gary.
Thanks, Liz. And it's truly an honor to be in conversation with so many colleagues who are doing like-minded and like-inspired work, trying to overcome the systems of oppression that we're talking about, from gender to race-based to white patriarchy-based. And David, thank you for sharing those reflections at the beginning. A lot of our roots in Brazil were informed by some of the young men's work happening back in the 90s that you cited. And I believe in our very first version of Program H, we cite the manual that you put the logo up at the beginning. So this work truly is circulating and coming back. And as Liz mentioned, the work was born in low-income contexts in favelas in Rio de Janeiro, where similar but certainly different contexts of oppression were happening, between high rates of police violence, high rates of vigilante and basically hired off-duty police to carry out violence as well as gang violence, and then the ongoing racism and economic inequality that continue to exist in many urban areas of Brazil. And also framed within a belief that attitudes about manhood mattered. They're related to and they're connected to men's use of violence against women, in terms of how men become socialized into using certain forms of violence against other men, the outcomes of young people, men and women, in terms of their educational life trajectory and other aspects of their development. And we've since built a science out of that work, finding that in fact, the norms around gender, internalized and lived, shape a number of the key behaviors that we're trying to prevent and shape, never making that only an individual issue, that is framed within the social climate. So next slide, please. And again, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're not doing this alone. We never want to frame it that masculinities are problematic in certain low-income or communities of color, that we see these harmful norms related to masculinity as framed and also built within racism and homophobia and transphobia and other systems of oppression. And that we always see our gender equity work linked to social justice as our foundational approaches and principles, that we're not ever separating out the gender equity work from the broader social justice work. The next slide, please. What we found in both the research that we've carried out in Pittsburgh, and Promundo has done research with partners now in more than 50 countries, and household survey research with young men and young women and adult women, is that how much we believe in a set of rigid norms related to gender is directly related to a number of key behavioral outcomes. Next slide, please. One of the studies in which we affirmed this recently is building on Paul Kivel's expression of the man box, and many of you working with the Oakland Men's Project way back when, and A Call to Men, of course, has also used that expression. We've, looking again at those norms with population-based data, the more you believe in this thing that many of us call the man box, the more likely you are to have thought about suicide, to have depressive symptoms, to use multiple forms of violence against intimate partners as well as others, to sexually harass, to carry out unsafe sexual behavior, among others. That list could go on. But all that we use to say these norms matter, how they are lived and rehearsed, how they're internalized into attitudes going from the social space into our own psyches, matters a huge amount, and hence the origins of the program. The next slide, please. And so what we called Program H, it was kind of a lazy name, H for hombres in Spanish and homens in Portuguese, the Man Project, essentially is building on Paulo Freirean traditions in Brazil, that raising awareness about how harmful norms related to gender influence our lives is a potentially powerful tool for supporting healthier behaviors, as well as promoting youth activism to change some of the oppressive structures around us. And so while the activities get enshrined in the manuals, we think it is equally important what happens in community campaigns and community activism, particularly led by young people themselves, and the relationships that are established and modeled by facilitators, teachers, and others. Next, please. So we started working on the manual in 2000, and with similar formative research of the kind that Liz described in Pittsburgh, first in Brazil, Mexico, Bolivia, and Peru were the first 4 countries we started this work in partnership with the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization, and mapping masculinities across several key topics: reproductive and sexual health, fatherhood and caregiving. That is, how much do we raise boys to see care as part of our repertoire and equally expected of us? How do we build it, and how do we think about violence in multiple forms? We're talking about sexual violence, but we've also talked about multiple forms of violence, men against men, as well as young men's violence against young women. Reasons and emotions is our mental health component of that, how men do or do not seek help, how we're raised to be able to express anger, but not necessarily to express vulnerability, for example, and then some specific activities around safe sex behavior and seeking HIV testing in context, particularly of context of high HIV prevalence when we started some of this work years back. We did multiple testing of the material in several countries. Next slide, please. And it's, over the years, these 20 years that the material has existed, we've partnered now in more than 30 countries in adapting the material to local context. It is never a cookie cutter approach. It is always done with partners around mapping how masculinities are framed in local contexts. And so there's some of them, and I particularly like this slide that has the seal of the Republic of Pittsburgh next to several other country flags there. But it is always embedded in local context. And as Liz mentioned, and I heard a couple of examples that you all shared earlier, we're also interested in how we can embed this to go to scale. In Brazil, we've been able to make it part of the school curriculum in 5 states. That's been more challenging in the current political climate, but still nonetheless has happened. In Mexico, with the Ministry of Health, it did get officially adapted by the Adolescent Health Department of Mexico's Health Ministry. In several countries in Europe, it's become part of the school curriculum. You see the Croatia outlined there. The same has happened in Serbia. That big flag just above the Pittsburgh flag of the Steelers logo there is Rwanda, where it's also become part of an officially sanctioned after-school program. So just to give you a few examples of how we've worked to carry out rigorous impact evaluation of the approach, and then work with partners to try to build it into large institutions. Next slide, and then I'll transition over. What we've learned from those, we have written pages and lots of journal articles about the outcomes in other settings, But I think if we've got to boil it down to 4 key issues, is to say, one, and these are, that it is in this order of importance. It starts with well-trained facilitators who get it. The relationships that are built, the modeling of behaviors, the having adult or other young people trained. We've sometimes done it as peer approaches as well. Whether these are teachers, coaches, after-school workers, juvenile justice workers, health educators attached to ministries of health in some countries, it doesn't really matter where that is. What it really matters is facilitators themselves who have gone through a reflective learning process. They've internalized this. They believe in the norms that are being promoted, and they also develop relationships along the way with the young people who participate. Second, the importance of extended sessions. We did a truncated version that we had to, and Liz will talk a bit about that, of how we framed it in the case of Pittsburgh. But our kind of go-to of what works is to try it over a 4-month period of time in a weekly session. So typically trying to get from 12 to 16 weeks, where there's time for life to happen between sessions. There's time to internalize the critical thinking and the relationship building that happens in the sessions into real life. Third, that it's connected to, it's not just what happens in the group education session, but that it's connected either to community or sometimes in-school campaigns, to other civic engagement, to other important adults who help mirror this. We found that if it's only in the group session itself, that often we can have fantastic awareness of how sexism and harmful norms related to masculinity interact with other forms and systems of oppression, an intention to change on the part of young people, but they go out into a world that continues to model unhealthy forms of masculinity. And finally, and Liz and colleagues will talk about that as well, that we connect it to other structural interventions. It is not only healthy, equitable masculinities that we're going to save and really make deep changes in the conditions of lives that in the settings that we're working in. We also have to attach it to access to education, access to mental health services, and particularly access to job opportunities and economic empowerment. And we've worked across a number of settings to try to build those structural interventions, and Liz and colleagues will offer some reflections on that as well. So let me stop there and hand it back over.
Thank you so much, Gary. I think, you set us up so well to now move into a deeper discussion about Manhood 2.0, but I think we'd love to hear from our audience and just get a sense of how familiar you all are currently with Manhood 2.0. So Tori, if you go ahead and launch that question. And so folks, you should see a polling question asking you, how familiar are you with Manhood 2.0? There are several different choices to choose from, but it looks like at this point, about 3/4 of our audience is saying not familiar. We do have about 20% somewhat familiar. We have a handful of people that are very familiar. Team, that should give you a sense of kind of where folks are in the audience in terms of what they know about Manhood 2.0. We'll go ahead and end that poll, and I will hand it over to you, Liz and Allison.
Perfect. So thank you for that context and history, Gary, because really Pittsburgh is one of the chapters of the sort of evolution, adaptation of this program. And I'm incredibly grateful for the collaboration that we've had with Promundo in developing this version of a curriculum. And next slide, the work and the content, right, as Gary was alluding to, is in the context of funding through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for which we are immensely grateful, and to do a large-scale cluster randomized trial. We needed to really kind of delimit the ways in which the curriculum was implemented. And with input from the CDC, opted to focus on the curriculum without the community campaigns and ongoing civic engagement that has been a critical piece of Promundo's work in this space. And so to bracket that, The idea here was to integrate sexual health promotion, and you're going to hear more about this from Jose and Jose Garth in a moment, but integrating sexual health promotion with gender norms change and bystander behavior, upstander behavior around sexual violence prevention, and in many ways, a real mashup of some of the really key core principles around prevention of sexual violence and partner violence. In addition, however, because this is comprehensive sexual health education, we happen to live in Pittsburgh, which is, while the city of Pittsburgh is quite progressive, there were many partnering school districts with which I work, where when they saw the content of what we were developing, certainly would be like, we can't do this in our school district. And as Gary is alluding to, even in Brazil, where they have been successful with doing school-based implementation in the current political climate, there are challenges. And so what we opted to do was community-based prevention programming. And I want to underscore what Gary was saying earlier, is that this is not because of low resource, neighborhoods with concentrated disadvantage that are historically oppressed are more violent. That is by far not where we're going here, but in fact, that we wanted to reach young people for whom school-based prevention programming may not resonate, may not be relevant, and certainly for young people who have been pushed out of school, that we wanted to ensure that they had access and equitable access to prevention programming like this. This also gave us an opportunity to think about sustaining violence prevention work. And it is really amazing to have Jose Garth on this call with us, because he has been part of Manhood 2.0 facilitation, but has gone on to become one of our lead facilitators and trainers of community facilitators for our subsequent work in this space. The idea here was to work in neighborhoods, in Black churches, in libraries, in youth serving agencies and community centers, to identify those wonderful magnets who are just recognized by young people as safe adults in their neighborhood, and to support them to deliver this curriculum. And it is flexible, it's modular, so it's an 18-hour curriculum, which for the purposes of the study, we broke into 3 6-hour sessions or 9 2-hour sessions, but essentially generally once a week, but shorter than what Gary was talking about earlier. And in this modular format, exploring masculinity norms, sexual consent and sexual violence, as well as sexual health promotion. And of course, this is iterative, and the content continues to build throughout the curriculum. Next slide. So in terms of community-based, we have, there's so much I love about our region, but we have extraordinary community partners that included the Urban League of Greater Pittsburgh, the YMCA, numerous Black churches, the Carnegie Library, and so forth. And so we were actually able to do this study in 21 of our neighborhoods with concentrated disadvantage. And we continue to have relationships with and partner with many of the leaders in these neighborhoods. And next slide. As a cluster randomized controlled trial, what we did was actually randomize at the level of neighborhood. So not by facilitator, not by young people. So it was clustered by neighborhood. And we were able to enroll 866 young men, male identified young people, 13 to 19 year olds. And half of the sites, half of the neighborhoods were allocated to the Manhood 2.0 program. And then the comparison. And when we first wrote the proposal, we thought we would do something that was kind of more life skills oriented. And with guidance from the CDC and based on existing literature, we chose to offer job skills training, thinking that while that would be value added in these neighborhoods, that job skills training, while has been shown to reduce youth violence, would be unlikely to move the needle on sexual violence and partner violence. And what we found is, as you see here in the infographic, that actually both programs led to substantial declines in sexual violence. And this is youth self-report of use of violence, but there was no significant difference between the two groups. As we dug into the data a little bit more, what we did also see in the Manhood 2.0 participants were things that you all will recognize as part of our sexual and partner violence work, which included moving the needle on greater intentions to intervene and greater recognition of what constitutes abusive behavior. But here's the interesting part. With the job skills training, what we saw was a significantly greater reduction in cyber sexual abuse. So the job readiness training youth actually reported using cyber sexual abuse less than their counterparts receiving the Manhood 2.0 program, which really gets to sort of the crux of what Gary was talking about earlier, which is we think that structural interventions are a critical piece of sexual and partner violence prevention. So more to say about the study. I'm happy to pick up questions in the chat as well, but also want to turn this over now to Allison, to Dr. Solba, to share some more thoughts about listening to young people's stories.
All right, and can you advance to the next slide, Tori? Thank you, and I am delighted to be here and be part of this with you all today, and to have a chance to talk about some of the qualitative research that we did to accompany this implementation of Manhood 2.0, and in particular today focusing on interviews that we carried out with 52 young men who had participated in the Manhood programming, kind of at the end of programming, and gathering reflections on their experiences, as well as really focusing in on masculinity, intersections with racial identity, as well as multiple forms of violence, and how these experiences can help us inform and move this work forward. Next slide, please. And so what I'm going to do is focus in on kind of key themes and focusing in on 3 of these today. And one of those centers around definitions of manhood. And I want to just touch on this piece briefly so that we have a little bit more time to dive into the next 2 themes that I'll get into on the subsequent slide in a little bit more detail. But we asked participants during the interviews to really reflect on their personal definitions of manhood. And some of the key themes that emerged in these discussions really centered on traditional masculine attributes. So ideas around responsibility, the role of young men as providers, and really this sort of action orientation in which many aspects of masculinity were defined around sort of doing or achieving for oneself and later for one's family and community. And so there was a lot of discussion around sort of more traditional elements, as well as interesting ways that young men were really subverting or challenging traditional norms. And I think one of the key themes that emerged here was around emotional expression, and really the role of emotional expression both as a form of vulnerability, but also as a form of strength. And I thought that that was one key piece, an element, in reflecting on their experience in the program that really came to the forefront. And the other theme that really tied through a lot of young men's narratives was this idea of growing into manhood as a journey towards becoming a moral agent. And so I want to sort of frame the discussion of the next pieces around some of these ideas of manhood, and I think really understanding the key ways in which this programming may have allowed young men opportunities to sort of reflect on these and challenge more traditional elements, and also sort of come up with their own internalized interpretations of manhood and masculinity. Next slide. And so I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking through 2 other key themes that emerge from this work. First, focusing on influences on manhood, and here talking about family and community relationships, the role of interpersonal and structural racism and racial pride in shaping manhood and identity. And then lastly, turning to reflections around experiences with the manhood programming and violence prevention more broadly, and really again echoing what Gary spoke to as well as Liz around the critical importance of facilitators as natural mentors, as well as the importance of fostering safe spaces for people to be able to reflect and grow. Next slide, please. And so first, thinking about influences on manhood, really the piece that came to the forefront here was around the critical importance of family and community connections. And for many young men, this included strong influences from parental figures, including both fathers and mothers. And so on the left, for instance, one young man reflected, well, my dad is an influence. He's a hard worker. He makes sure we always have stuff we really need, not stuff we actually want, just to make sure we always have clothes on our backs and a roof over our head, food in our stomachs. And another young man reflected, first, it was my mom. Because, you know, I mean, a woman can really teach you everything that a man can. She did her best. So knowing that she always told me how to be a man. Next slide. And in addition to influences from kind of immediate family members, many program participants also discussed ways in which they supplemented these experiences with other father figures. So male role models within their extended family, as well as within the broader community networks, in helping to discern and create sort of their own definitions of manhood. One young man reflected, any dude can go around the street and say, I'm a man. We all know what a man looks like. And me, for one, I know I've been around. I grew up around dudes like my uncles and all them. So I know what an actual man is like. And Manhood 2.0 just helped me understand more about a man was. And another young man reflected, I have a big influence from my grandfather. He's been through a lot in his life, and it takes a man to go through that and keep pushing. And really integrated with these reflections were relationships with program facilitators and sort of the dynamics of interactions between these interpersonal relationship networks and the content of the programming, which I think is really eloquently described here. My uncle is basically my hero. He's who I look up to because most of the males in my family have criminal backgrounds. Another way the program helped me was for most of my life, my father was in jail for a crime he didn't commit. So I literally had no guidance for becoming a man. So that's another way this program helped me a lot. Next slide, please. And additionally, many of the participants in the program during these interviews gave voice to the chronic stress and pervasive experiences of interpersonal and structural racism in shaping their daily lived experiences, as well as their definitions of manhood and kind of identity exploration. And that for many Black participants in particular, they felt that in this process of becoming men, that they were viewed by society as inherent failures. One young man reflected, he's Black, he's gonna try and hurt us. We don't get away because we're Black and people are racist. And really what is a quintessential part of adolescent development, sort of the ability to take risks was, and sort of try out different roles, was viewed as extremely dangerous. With really no tolerance for any mistakes and incredibly high stakes, especially for young Black men. And one participant reflected, as a man, you have to know the right from wrong. If you don't, you're going to be in and out of jail. You're going to be dead. And as a man, you've basically been through life for real. You know life has its ups and downs. You know you're going to lose people. Next slide, please. And the role of heightened policing and pervasive experiences with police in the lives of young men also really rose to the forefront. And for the vast majority of participants, this really felt like more of a risky rather than a protective influence in their lives. And one participant reflected, I've also lost someone to police violence. It was a good friend of my brother's. He was often around. One day we was walking down the street from his mama's house. That's he got pulled over. He refused to cooperate with the cop. So he was beat to death and shot, or beat and shot. And that officer is currently still what he calls protecting the city. Now, still. no charges. Next slide, please. And in the face of pervasive and sometimes unrelenting experiences of racism and discrimination, that some of the participants found the necessity of combating racism as a motivation in shaping their manhood. And so one young man reflected, I feel like I got to stand up for people because I can't let society shape me. They see us as products. They can make so much money off of us. I feel like I don't want to be a product to society. I want to be me. It just makes me want to work harder. And sometimes it's harder for us. And for some young men, attempting to challenge the foundations of racism, sort of gaining individual autonomy, was tied to a strong sense of positive racial identity, reflected here by a young man who noted, I am Black, but I'm a proud Black African American. I am proud of my skin tone, and ain't nobody ever going to take that from me. And another young man reflected, to stand tall with pride and not care about what other people think, but to take your own approach on how you feel, how you should feel, and how you feel about yourself. And really the vulnerability and that sort of deep reflective nature that young men shared with us in these conversations, highlighted tremendous challenges that they were experiencing, and simultaneously really lifted up an incredible amount of resilience and the critical role of sort of creating and fostering relationships to help young people through this identity exploration. Next slide. And sort of shifting gears to think about manhood in the context of violence prevention and young people's experiences with the programming, that the critical importance of program facilitators, again, really rose to the forefront, and particularly being able to connect with facilitators who they felt like were part of their community, who could foster authentic relationships that were trusting, that felt real, and authentic, and that could transcend the specific programming, was really key. And so one participant reflected, I realized that I loved the program leader because she was just an awesome lady who just actually fought for kids and fought for their rights as humans. And I loved that, and it made me want to talk more. And another young man reflected, I thought it was just going to be a bunch of BS but we actually talked about some real life situations and stuff that we actually went through, like having sex and like abusive relationships, and like how people that know people like that have been through that. Like we have teachers tell us about stuff they've been through. I didn't think it was going to be as explicit as it was. Next slide. And again, really this idea of connecting with facilitators in a way that goes beyond the curriculum to really foster meaningful relationships. And so one young man reflected, I guess he just knows how us teenagers work out, how we carry ourselves or get along with each other. When I was at the program, he shared stories with us about things he'd been through, and it would be very related to how things we're going through or things we've been through. Next slide. And the last piece I want to touch on was the critical importance of fostering safe, inclusive spaces for these dialogues, and that many participants reflected on Manhood 2.0 programming as really providing a temporary reprieve from pervasive experiences of both community and interpersonal violence, and fostering opportunities for them to listen and learn and reflect and grow. And so I want to share this reflection from one of our participants. In relation to this program, it means a love for oneself and to project that image and reflect that onto others. In this case, I've seen a lot of brothers who never had a chance to love themselves. They grew up in households where it was wrong for them to learn how to be in touch with their emotions. Their mothers would shun them. People would call them pussies and bitches because of who they wanted to be, which is why people get into that peer pressure, begin to create these egos of self-sustaining madness that creates a loop of negative thoughts. So it was, for me, Love is, in a sense, having a place for us to be able to break the cycle for a few minutes. Next slide, please. And so, I think there are so many takeaways from this work. And I think in many ways, I continue to learn and grow each time I revisit the interview transcripts. I think some of the key takeaways that I want to highlight here are really the manhood as a journey and the way in which participants sort of describe this journey as a moral process towards adulthood. And that this process is often constrained by significant social and structural factors, most poignantly around interpersonal and systemic experiences of racism. And that in this process, relationships matter and they're transformational. And the critical importance of fathers and other extended father figures and community members in helping young men navigate the challenges that they're experiencing. And I think from a programming standpoint, it's really essential that we're thinking about how to meet participants in this complex identity formation and really making sure that what the programming that we're designing and delivering is attuned to their lived experiences and really speaking to these intersections. And truly critical to this work are program facilitators that are rooted in communities such that we're able to actually build natural mentoring relationships that transcend the content of specific curricula to really create transformational connections that are so broadly protective and important in young people's lives. And I think additionally, an intersectional approach that simultaneously centers gender equity and racial justice is imperative in this work, and that also elevates the voices and experiences of young people. And I'm deeply grateful to everyone who took time and shared their stories with us to help us move this work forward. All right, next slide.
Thank you so much, Allison. There is so much appreciation happening in the text chat for sharing the voices of those participants. And so I just wanted to thank you for that, to let you know that that was happening. And thank you all for sharing, your reflections. We would love to hear from our audience. So Allison just went through, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the question in the chat, which is, which one of the takeaways that Allison just walked us through resonates with your community? And then I think what I'll ask you to do, Tori, is if you would go back one slide, thank you. You can see what those takeaways were. So we'd love to know from you all, what one of those takeaways resonates most with the communities that you're working with. And David, I'd also like to pull you back into this while we kind of give folks a moment to respond for any reflections.
Well, great. Well, thank you. This is so great. It was great both hearing the what Allison was sharing and also the conversation that people are having. And I think it's about, to me, it's about how when we do our evaluation, it's important to get those participants' voices and to show the connection. And to me, it's that, and Gary had shown this at the very beginning of, is that good facilitation is not about getting information out. Good facilitation is about connection. And connection is where transformation can take place. And that I think there's so much. And so I'm seeing that so many people are, a lot of people are talking about the social and structural constraints, and then the intersectional approach, and some are, so I'm seeing a lot of it. Manhood is a process, is I think another piece that becomes a really important piece. But so it's great seeing people sharing what resonates in their community, and think about in the programming that you're going to be doing in your community, where's the places that we need to put our energy to be able to move forward. So yeah, this is really exciting. So Ashley, what do you see as you've been thinking about this?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that too, David. I just wanted to highlight, Phoebe asked kind of like the $1 million question of, if we know about the outcomes from Manhood 2.0 and job skills training, why don't we put them together? And so Liz and Gary, thank you for weighing in that's you know, what should happen, right? That combination of gender transformative programming, as Liz says, tied to structural intervention. So just wanted to pull that out because it's definitely, you know, something that we absolutely thought about when we read the study. So Allison,
Yeah.
I want to thank you again.
I want to just add one thing,
David.
Ashley, in there, because I think that one thing we talk a lot about on Prevent Connect is, in our friends at Prevention Institute talk about a good solution solves multiple problems. And that I think that we need to be able to look at our work. We don't measure sexual violence outcomes for job training programs typically. And we need to be able to look at those types of ways and measure. And a lot of times people don't want to talk about the sexual violence and that those issues, but if we can find out ways that we're doing it, because we're doing it all the time, we just have to find the ways to really hone that. And if we do that in the context that these takeaways do, then it's going to really strengthen our work that we're moving forward with.
Absolutely. Thanks, David, for adding that. Great. Well, I want to now introduce you all to Jose Garth. And Jose, we are really excited to hear from you about what it's like to actually implement Manhood 2.0 and the lessons that you've learned through that process. So I will pass it to you.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, you know, through the years of having the pleasure of working with all the great folks that we have partnered with, especially the youth, it's just been such a joy. And that's why I really wanted to start off with this first piece too. It's not just been a joy, but it's been fulfilling in so many different ways, just watching that growth and change. As Allison was saying, one of those key takeaways is manhood being a process, right? And I think one of the great things that we've seen throughout all of this is just what the effectiveness of these safe spaces can be. And it can be hard to build programs around these sometimes. You know, this being a study, you know, even within a lot of research projects, we see a certain level of hesitation to center relationship building and to center that kind of growth and change that can be a little bit harder to get to. And Allison did a great job in that qualitative piece and through those interviews to really see how that does come out in these conversations. But through all the programs that I've run over the years, you know, it's really just been, to me, one of the most important things, because for me, that relationship building is so central to anything, right? Whether you're teaching math, whether you're teaching, you know, healthy masculinities or whatever it may be, you need that relationship so that way folks don't feel like they got to retain everything in that moment. And if they don't remember when they leave that space, it's gone. So they know they have that trusted adult that was in the room that they can go back to and rely on. So, you know, just really seeing the trust that's built inside of the room, really seeing that vulnerability that is being modeled inside the room between facilitators and students that we just don't often see in all male gender groups. As often we don't really get to see that space too much, you know, and to be able to normalize it and witness it on such a regular basis. Once again, it's just been so powerful, not just for the participants, but also for the facilitators. You know, one of the programs that I did for years was a peer education program. And when I started that, I really saw that transformative effect for myself as I started teaching sex ed about my own views on sexuality and sexual health through teaching, that you really kind of see it just comes through. And when I see these facilitators do that same thing through this conversation, you really do see them going through that process, right? Trying to teach these facilitators that it's not about being an expert in healthy masculinities necessarily that they're bringing into the room, but just being expert facilitators and allowing these young men to witness them and their peers' transformation and also the transformation of facilitators as we go through these conversations. It's just so important and just really enlightening. We can go to the next slide. So I was brought into this work as someone who was focused on sexual and reproductive health. I worked at Planned Parenthood of Western Pennsylvania for about 9 years teaching sex ed. And I just really wanted to take this moment to really help everyone recognize that this program is sex ed, right? It's not billed as such. You know, it's billed as violence prevention, and I ran violence prevention programs for a number of years outside of Manhood 2.0. And as those of you who work inside a nonprofit world I'm sure know, when it comes to funding and partnerships and things like that, we often kind of get these piecemeal effects, you know, and for different reasons, for funding, right? For funders funding for, you know, STI prevention, it's kind of hard to slip into violence prevention pieces when they're trying to prevent STIs. But I've also read lots of grants and helped write lots of grants. And I feel we use words like holistic and whatnot, and safe space for that matter, right? But maybe don't necessarily get honored as much in how we present the work or build the work, if you will, or even measure the results of that work, right? I feel a lot of times when we're doing these studies, so much of the focus is on the more measurable outcomes, right? So like, you know, what kind of attitude changes were there? What kind of knowledge gains were there and whatnot? But sorry, I'm a drifter. But once again, this is, you know, once again, at the heart of this, to me, this is really sex ed. And I feel it's important that we understand that, because we need more of this inside of our schools, inside of our after school programs, inside of our community organizations. We need this as a lifelong process, right? We're going to be humans until the day we die. We need to learn how to do human things. And that means learning how to deal with our identity, right? When we're talking about gender, that is a part of what our sexuality is, right? When we're talking about what gender means to us and our communities and how we are identified and how we identify ourselves, that is sex ed, right? It's not just that below the waist piece, right? It's not just when we're talking about how babies are made or how we prevent STIs when we're going to sexual health, right? We don't get to, once again, turn ourselves into these silos. We are a whole human being, and we're dealing with whole human beings all the time. So when we're talking about our feelings and emotions and relationships, that's all part of being a human being. And being a human being, we are, you know, sexual beings. It's part of our sexuality. So I really feel it's important that we acknowledge that and keep on pushing that, so we can kind of get rid of that stigma and fear of anything that has sex in it, right? So sexuality is not this thing that we have to push aside, and only, you know, the strange, you know, quote unquote freaks or whatever you might want to say, you know, deal with this. Like, this is a human thing, right? We come from a long line of folks that are humans who have sex, who have sexuality, right? Our parents, our grandparents, our great-great-grandparents. That's all of our legacy. So we don't want to shy away from that. We certainly don't in this program, which I really appreciate. We can go to the next slide. As part of this safe space, we really leave a lot of space for the students and the participants to be their true selves and not really, and it's a hard thing to get them to not be in the space of what do the adults in the room want to hear, right? How do I do this the right way, right? We give them the space to be flawed. Once again, they're human beings. So they come with flaws like all of us do. And with that comes a lot of these isms and phobias, right? We see the sexism and misogyny in the room. It comes out. We see the homophobia and the transphobia in the room. It comes out. You know, and once again, that's part of that process. Moving towards healthy masculinity, there is no, you know, there is no point where you get to check it off like, I'm a great man. I did it. I'm no longer have any sexist ideas or homophobic ideas. I treat everyone equally. I'm colorblind and gender blind, right? That's not what the goal is. The goal is to stay in this process until our last day here and to bring as many folks along with us as we do that. So it's been a great challenge, but also it's come with great rewards as people start to see what they don't often look at as homophobia, right? One of the phrases I hear a lot is like, you know, oh, I don't care, you could be gay or whatever. You know, I don't hate on anybody. And then they put the button there like, but just don't be gay around me. You know, don't act too gay around me, right? So really have them look at that and say like, okay, so you don't want to be homophobic, but let's look at that statement you just made. You know, somebody said they don't hate Black people. They just don't like when Black people act so Black. You'd assume that they might have a problem with Black people, right? So it's the same thing with these homophobia and transphobia as well. So it's been a great challenge, but also, like I said, I've seen a lot of great changes in the room through these open and honest conversations and through having that truly vulnerable space. We can go to the next slide. Through the all too, you know, we found that importance as folks were talking about earlier about really not looking at the deficits of different identities, right? When we're talking about sexism, we're not looking at like how hard it is to be a woman. We can look at women and celebrate womanhood and what that is. We can talk about the issues of masculinity while also celebrating masculinity. We can talk about racism, but also talk about this positive racial identity. there is a certain level of exhaustion that comes with certain identities, right? When you're part of the LGBT community and everyone's always talking about all the issue with that, you know, as opposed to celebrating historical figures and current figures, or just the culture that comes with being Black or whatever, you know, like how we can really embrace that and not just stick to this whole like, man, this is hard, or man, this is hard. It's like, well, nah, like, you know, I've been Black my whole life. I've been having a great time with it. You know, it's not my race that's ever been an issue. It's been racism, and really sussing that out and giving them that space to really love on themselves and love on each other for who they are, no matter what the race is. We can go to the next slide. Once again, these relationships are so key and so important. And I really want to push everyone that's listening to this call who's running any sort of program that you're really, if you're measuring your programs, that you're trying to measure this piece. How do we see how safe students felt in the room while having these conversations? How connected they felt to the facilitators and their peers in the room, right? We can measure these things. They're not impossible to measure, you know, and they're just as important, in my opinion, as, you know, what kind of knowledge gains there were and what kind of attitude changes there were as well, right? We are building a community, we're building a fellowship, right? And it's really important that we do what we can to measure and highlight how we change it through these kinds of groups. We can go to the next slide. As with everything, it's been a challenge with this age and stage appropriate piece. So we had a bit of a wide range of ages that were involved in the Manhood program. And as much as possible, we tried to really make sure that we kept people lumped, you know, the 15 and 16-year-olds together and the 18 and 19-year-olds together, you know, close together, because we do know that there's a big difference in age and stage development and what we need to be presenting to people at those different stages in their life, right? So, you know, some of our younger participants likely aren't involved in romantic relationships. So, you know, maybe we're not sticking that topic as much as we would with some of our older students who are engaged in that or engaged in sexual activity already, right? We're talking about the below the waist sexual health piece. There's a bit of a difference for people who are moving into sexual activity, already engaged in sexual activity, versus people who are like still kind of grossed out by the idea of like holding hands with somebody or kissing somebody, right? So, you know, really being conscious of that and doing what we can to kind of teach to the center and being as inclusive as possible to all the ages and stages that are in the room has been a really important piece throughout all of this. We can go to the next slide. And as folks have been pointing out, you know, one of the most beautiful parts of this whole program and the approach has been making sure that we were taking facilitators from the community. But once again, if we're building these relationships, we don't have these students build relationships with people that they don't have access to later on, right? You know, you don't want them coming from this one neighborhood and then, you know, there's somebody from a whole different city or out of the county who's coming in. So when they want to reach out, they can't find this person or have access to that person again. And also just to see it modeled, like people from my community that look like me are modeling these things and showing these things and having these conversations. And it's not some outside group. It's not those people over there do that. It's like, no, people here where I live do this. You know, it's my coach, it's my school counselor, it's my teacher, or whatever it may be. You know, my mentor or whatever is the one who's doing this as well. So it's been really great. And also, once again, it builds that fellowship within the community itself. So it goes beyond just what's in the classroom, and it's what's in the classroom and what's in the schoolroom, the schoolhouse, as opposed to the after school programs, as well as in the streets or wherever it may be, to really give this kind of form of leadership and facilitation to the whole community and not just those that are participating inside this program. Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much, Jose. Before we go to our audience, I did just want to pull out a couple of things from the audience, actually. You know, Jose, it really resonated when you said that this is sex ed. You know, Cassandra said sexual health promotion is sexual violence prevention. Sarah said, yes, violence prevention is sex ed. Someone asked if there was an applause emoji. So, you know, it was really resonating, the things that you were sharing. I wanted to also pull out, you know, Beth said that the whole, you know, but don't be gay around me really hits home, and mentioned that's been highlighted with how Little Nas X has been reacted to. David underlined the fact that community connectedness is a protective factor to prevent violence. And so those connections that you were sharing about. And then Cynthia was wondering if you actually have a website, Jose. So if you have a website, feel free to drop that in the chat. But we'd love to know from you all, what questions do you have for Jose? Maybe you have questions for Allison or Liz or Gary. This is a time that we have to be able to explore some of those. And Teresa asks how we can contact you, Jose. So it sounds like that is a burning question at the top of people's minds. So yeah, Jose, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
I do see a question.
I'll put my email in the chat now. You all, I think, have it too. It's going to be up there. I do not have a website to answer that question.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm noticing, thank you, Jose and Ashley. I'm seeing there's several questions about facilitators. And for Manhood 2.0, were the facilitators male? And were they, or if you consider it important to make at least one of them was male? And there was a sort of a question about how do you train and were the process of training facilitators. Gary put this out at the very beginning that well-trained facilitators was an important lesson learned from the work that Promundo has done and also learned from here. So like insights from any of you about how it's being implemented and what it's the training mechanism.
I can say as far as training goes, well, first of all, this Manhood has gone beyond just the study. So it's been adapted as well for a gendered version for young girls called Sisterhood, and also through the trainings that we've done, I've also tried to stay in contact with all the facilitators and support them throughout, by also giving them other curricula to build on beyond just Manhood, so that way they can continue to work with the young men and continue building upon those spaces that have been built through Manhood 2.0.
Our kind of chief recommendation for the training is that the facilitators, male identified or female identified, and I think it is useful to often have male identified facilitators, but it's not essential. There's some amazing women facilitators who are able to engage in these discussions with young men. But a key aspect is kind of, what they tell us on the plane, adjust your own mask before you try to adjust the mask on the person next to you, of really going through the material itself. And David, I think you highlighted this at the beginning of, kind of your own journey into healthy, connected, just masculinity as a pathway to, being able to be an educator in this space. And I think that, and I think that was highlighted so clearly in the information that Allison presented, of that ability for me to have thought about my own situation space and talking about this work so key, or these topics, as making me available to build a relationship with the young people who are participating. So, it really is about having facilitators themselves go through the activities, not just how am I going to talk about this with young people, but my own journey in thinking about my privilege, my space, how I have acted in harmful ways to others. That self-awareness being a key piece to being a good facilitator. I don't know, Jose or Liz or Allison, if you want to comment on that.
So I will, thank you. It is, so there's two pieces to this, right? Because I suspect that some of you are like, how do you find these facilitators? And I will put my contact information in the chat also, but we use a process that many of you are familiar with called asset mapping. It's really asking various community members and young people themselves, who are some of the recognized adults in your neighborhood? Who are the folks who are already doing remarkable work with young people, or who might be somebody who's interested? And we have continued to nurture these relationships. And Jose just led a kind of booster session for our facilitators just a few weeks ago that was just beautiful. And then Allison leads our program called Empowering Teens to Thrive, which is a community-based wraparound for young people who have experienced gun violence. And many of our facilitators from Manhood 2.0 and Sisterhood 2.0 are now funded to serve also as community mentors for young people. And so this has been a very iterative process, and it is really about building relationships with the facilitators as well.
Yeah, and I think in terms of our Empowering Teens to Thrive work and really facilitating those ongoing relationships, that it's in the context of ongoing implementation of manhood and sisterhood programming, that many times young people who have experienced a lot of challenges sort of those come to the forefront in the context of the group-based programming. And now we have the opportunity to kind of continue those relationships one-on-one in this wraparound mentoring program. And so there's lots of synergy between kind of participating in the group-based, sort of gender transformative work, and then also working one-on-one with mentors, really focused more broadly on multiple types of violence and intersections with homicide survivorship, community violence, and many other forms of structural violence. And so I think that's created tremendous opportunities for us to continue to foster and facilitate these relationships. And I saw a question in the chat too, in terms of the vulnerability and kind of creating spaces within interviews to do this. And I did not conduct the interviews myself, but many of the facilitators and kind of research team who were embedded in this programming from day one and who had had the chance to really build these relationships with participants were deeply involved in the interview piece and really sort of setting the stage for a meaningful discussion and ensuring that everything was really creating anonymous spaces for young people too to share their experiences. And that was true on sort of surveys that people completed as well as the interview process, and us making sure that as we're working, with the narratives and the data, that we're not inadvertently kind of exposing the identity of anyone sort of involved in sharing those experiences with us. And I think all of those were really key pieces. And I think many of the participants really reflected on the opportunity to have a chance to really sit down and share their experiences and perspectives, and then to be able to see those perspectives folded into subsequent iterations of the work. I think that's the other really key piece, is not only like listening, but actually doing something about what you're hearing. And so I think that piece has been really sort of instrumental in kind of moving and iterating this work.
Thanks, Allison. I'm sorry, I'm like wading through all of the questions, and Liz, appreciate you for also sharing your contact information because we do only have 5 minutes left, so we will not get to all of these. So I'm just kind of looking at what is coming across. Let's see. David, did you see a question? Sorry, I'm getting a little bit stuck in my text chat. And I'm looking at the conversation that's happening too. So appreciate you all for sharing with each other.
So I think one theme and there's so many questions here about doing this. So a lot of people are asking about different settings that they can be doing it, whether it's going to be different ages, whether it's going to be other types of interviews, and it's about how to apply the lessons learned from Manhood 2.0 into different settings, whether it's going to be working in community colleges, whether it's going to be looking at people that are doing in providing healthcare services. So I know this is something that Liz cares about passionately. Well, actually, I know all of them do, but I know that Liz has done we've talked quite a bit about this work. So I'm talking about how you would be adapting some of these resources.
I can definitely speak to, like I said, personally, I've done a lot of violence prevention programming outside of Manhood 2.0, and I've adapted it for drug rehab centers, for parent groups, for my favorite pet project is for K through 5, which, as I told some folks the other day, you know, I call it violence prevention. It really is just sex ed for K through 5, but people get scared of that, so we call it violence prevention. This can be adapted to any setting that fits for you. I think it's important, though, when we're doing these adaptations, that we're careful about who is in the room. If we are targeting the LGBTQ community, we need to have folks from that community helping to adapt it. If we're targeting Black communities, we need Black folks in the room to help adapt that. I think that's one of the most important things, is that we're not adapting it for other people, we're adapting it with people that we're serving. But this kind of conversation works in, I can't imagine a setting that it would not work and not be related to with the right partnerships with the right folks.
Okay.
Thank you, Jose. Sorry, David. So, Tori, if you would go to I'd love to hear, and I apologize, my computer is freezing, but I know that our presenters wanted to just appreciate some folks. And then we'd really love to hear from you all as we close out this session. And Tori, if you would go to the final slide. We'd love to hear from you about something that you plan to incorporate following this conversation in the violence prevention work that you're doing. And let's see if I can put this in the text chat. We will be compiling all of the links that we have shared throughout the session today to share that with you, because if you have not read the study yet, encourage you to do so. You can also find some of those highlights on our blog. But this was a really rich conversation. Our presenters provided us with so much good information and food for thought. And so we'd love, as we get ready to close this session out, just know what's something that you plan to incorporate after this conversation. We'd love to hear from you. And I just want to appreciate and thank our guests today for everything that you brought to this conversation, all of the wisdom that you shared with us. I want to thank everyone in our audience for the great engagement and questions. Really appreciate you all. And we did record this session. We'll send an email when the recording is available to view. We'll let you know when our links are available. And you'll receive a survey link for a quick post-evaluation survey. And at the completion of that, you can download a certificate of attendance. David, I want to pass it back to you for any closing thoughts or comments.
Well, great. I want to thank everyone. I think Ashley already took my usual thanking at the end, but thank you, Allison, Liz, Gary, and Jose for your feedback. Thanks to our audience. And we are going to continue this conversation. We're going to talk more about gender transformative approaches along with other approaches into preventing violence on Prevent Connect. So we thank you for joining us. This is an ongoing conversation where we're going to learn from each other and learn ways to improve our practice, our research, and really make changes within our community. So thank you all for joining us. We'll keep the chat open for a couple minutes so people can do their thank yous and last minute comments. And this will conclude today's web conference. Thank you for joining us at Prevent Connect.